There is something deeply uncomfortable about watching a man smile for 50 years and then realizing you never actually knew what lived behind that smile. Ringo Starr spent a lifetime being the lovable one, the funny one, the one the world never worried about, and while John Lennon commanded rooms and Paul McCartney dazzled critics and George Harrison tortured himself with philosophy and Eastern spirituality, Ringo just grinned and waved two fingers at the cameras. The world adored him for it. But love built on a performance has a way of hiding things, and what this story reveals is that the real Ringo Starr, the man behind the drum kit and the peace signs and the all-star band tours, carried wounds so quiet and so specific that even people close to him were stunned when the truth finally surfaced. What makes it extraordinary is not just who he resented most, but the reason why. Because when you trace the full arc from a hospital bed in Liverpool, where a sick child first touched a drum, to the boardrooms, where lawyers dismantled the greatest band in rock history, you begin to understand something the cameras never captured. Ringo Starr's life was not the comedy it appeared to be. Underneath all of it ran a tragedy that never once stopped smiling. Richard Starkey was not supposed to survive his childhood, let alone become one of the most recognized musicians on the planet. Born in 1940 in the Dingle, one of Liverpool's most battered working-class neighborhoods, he came into a world already rattling from German bombs and grinding poverty, and his parents separated when he was only 3 years old. His mother cleaned houses to keep them afloat. At 6, his appendix ruptured and peritonitis set in, dropping him into a coma that kept him hospitalized for over a year and carved enormous gaps into his schooling that could never be recovered. And then at 13, tuberculosis arrived and took 2 more years from him, sealing him inside a sanatorium outside the city where time moved differently than it did for everyone else his age. 2 years of stillness, 2 years of separation, 2 years of learning the specific lesson that the world moves forward without stopping to wait for you. Those years didn't just cost him an education. They planted inside him a belief he would carry into adulthood, the quiet certainty that he was behind everyone else, that he was less than, that he would always be catching up. What pulled him through was a drum the nurses gave him to pass the time, a simple distraction that became a discipline and eventually the only thing in his life that made complete sense. Something in the rhythm, the physical certainty of it, told him this was something he could actually do. And for a boy who had lost so much time and so much confidence, that feeling became everything. By the early 1960s, Ringo had built a real reputation on the Liverpool music circuit, playing with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and musicians in that city considered him one of the finest drummers around, reliable and powerful and musical in ways that flashier players weren't. When the Beatles quietly moved to replace Pete Best in August of 1962, choosing Ringo wasn't a gamble. It was a calculated and deliberate decision made by people who knew exactly what they needed. The press, none of that mattered to them. Newspapers immediately framed him as the lucky lad who stumbled into a golden seat someone else had built, and critics called him the least talented Beatle before he had played a single public note with them. Inside the band itself, the hierarchy pressed down on him from every direction. John and Paul occupied the top, untouchable as songwriting gods. George fought from below them for his rightful space and recognition, and Ringo arrived at the bottom, expected to smile and keep time and sing the occasional novelty song and remain visibly grateful for the opportunity. The cruelest early blow landed during the recording of Love Me Do, when producer George Martin, not yet convinced by Ringo's abilities, brought in a session drummer named Andy White to play the part while Ringo stood at a microphone holding a tambourine and watched another man sit at his drums. He spoke about that moment for the rest of his life, always with the familiar laugh, always saying he made Martin apologize for it every single day. But the laugh was always covering something underneath it. The message had been delivered from the very first session. He was needed, but he was not trusted. Among all the relationships inside the Beatles, the one with George Harrison cut deepest in the quietest way. George and Ringo shared something that John and Paul, in their creative sovereignty, couldn't quite access or understand, because both men knew what it felt like to be overshadowed, to watch two people absorb all the air in every room and leave you arranging yourself carefully around the edges. That shared experience made George the closest thing Ringo had to a genuine equal inside the band, and the bond between them felt real and solid in a way that mattered. But through the late 1960s, something started shifting in a direction Ringo hadn't anticipated. George began building his musical world outside the Beatles entirely, working with Eric Clapton, with Billy Preston, with Bob Dylan, pulling in collaborators who had nothing to do with the four of them, and Ringo watched all of it from a distance without saying much, which was never his way. The grief wasn't jealousy. It was the specific ache of being left behind by someone you assumed would always be standing right beside you. The wound deepened considerably during the recording of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, George's most personal and emotionally exposed composition, when rather than turning to anyone inside the band for the iconic guitar part, George invited Clapton into the studio instead. Creatively, it made sense. As a signal to Ringo, it landed hard. He confided privately that he wasn't the only one in the band who understood exactly what it felt like to be passed over by someone who was supposed to be family. After the breakup, George disappeared into entirely new worlds, new albums, new philosophical frameworks, new collaborators for every project, and the intimacy between them never fully returned. In one conversation, Ringo told George with a tired half-smile that he seemed to have the whole world to work with, just never him. George smiled politely, said nothing. And that silence, Ringo would later reflect, was the most painful sound he ever heard from someone he considered a friend. John Lennon was the Beatle Ringo most genuinely admired, and something about John's sharpness and his refusal to perform dignity he didn't feel made him magnetically compelling to watch up close. Standing behind him on stage felt like standing at the edge of a storm, thrilling and slightly terrifying in equal measure, and for most of the Beatles' years, despite all the friction and the chaos, Ringo felt that John actually saw him, not merely as a drummer filling a necessary role, but as a man who belonged there. That changed gradually and then all at once when Yoko Ono became not just John's partner, but his second self, a creative and emotional unit that slowly displaced everything else around him. Ringo initially respected Yoko and didn't share the open resentment that Paul and George carried toward her growing presence in the studio. But over time, her involvement in the band's internal decisions became impossible to dismiss. During one recording session, she commented directly on Ringo's drumming, and the old John would have deflected it with a joke, would have defended his bandmate with the instinctive loyalty that had always been central to who he was. Instead, John turned to Ringo and said flatly, "Just keep it even. That's enough." The room dropped into silence. The words themselves weren't the wound. Everything behind them was, the signal that Yoko's judgment now sat higher than Ringo's standing inside the band they had all built together from nothing. Ringo told a friend afterward that they used to be a band, but by the end it was John and Yoko, and then everybody else arranged around them. The deepest grief wasn't born from anger. It came from loss, the loss of a leader he had trusted completely, a man who had once made him feel genuinely seen. And when John was shot dead in New York in December of 1980, just weeks after one of Ringo's last warm visits with him in the city, the wound sealed permanently shut. No recovery was possible anymore. No return to the old warmth. No chance for the connection to become something new. Paul McCartney delivered a different kind of pain, not the slow ache of being forgotten, but the sharper sting of being controlled by someone who refused to believe you were fully capable. After Brian Epstein's death in 1967, Paul stepped into the leadership vacuum with an intensity that frightened the people working around him, and while he was driven and brilliant and unquestionably the most organized force left in the band, his perfectionism curdled into something suffocating. He arranged every detail, questioned every instinct, and pushed the people around him past collaboration into something closer to employment. For Ringo, who had spent his entire career quietly fighting the suspicion that he didn't quite deserve his seat at the table, Paul's controlling presence functioned as a constant and recurring bruise on something that had never fully healed. The breaking point arrived during the White Album sessions in 1968 when Paul, dissatisfied with a drum pattern, asked Ringo to replay the part, and then again, each pass requiring smaller and smaller adjustments until something inside Ringo simply gave way. Without asking or warning, Paul sat down at Ringo's drum kit himself and demonstrated how he felt the part should be played. Ringo stood up slowly. He told Paul quietly that Paul clearly didn't need a drummer anymore, and then he walked out of the studio and stayed away for 2 full weeks. The other 3 were stunned into stillness. Flowers were sent and apologies were made, and he did come back. But something between them shifted permanently that afternoon in ways that no apology could reach. Every time Ringo settled behind his kit after that day, a part of him remembered what it felt like to watch someone else occupy his instrument. Decades later, Paul inducted Ringo into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015 with genuine warmth and visible affection, and their friendship softened considerably with age, but the memory of 1968 never disappeared. It simply learned to live quietly underneath everything else. Along the way, others left their marks. Jim Morrison struck Ringo as a man performing his own slow destruction and being worshipped for the spectacle of it, and Ringo, who had fought poverty and childhood illness and institutional skepticism for every inch of his career, had no patience for what he read as willful and theatrical waste. Peter Sellers, his co-star on the 1969 film The Magic Christian, dismissed him with the effortless condescension of someone deeply insecure below the surface, telling Ringo coldly when he offered a small creative suggestion on set to stick to his drums and leave the filmmaking to others, which was the same sentence the world had been delivering to him his entire life in different mouths. Mick Jagger represented a philosophy of performance Ringo found hollow, and Keith Moon, whom he genuinely liked as a person, was the kind of company that left you drained and privately relieved to make it home safely. None of those men, though, occupied the specific place in Ringo's bitterness that Alan Klein did, because Klein wasn't a creative rival or a careless friend. Klein was the man who studied the Beatles at their most vulnerable and then used everything he learned to finish the job of destroying them. After Epstein's death, the band sat financially exposed and emotionally fractured, with Apple Corps hemorrhaging money and trust inside the group corroding steadily over years, and into that vulnerability, Klein arrived from New York carrying the practiced manner of someone who makes desperate people feel rescued. John trusted him first. George followed. Ringo, exhausted and wanting nothing more than stability, signed on in 1969 and later admitted that Klein was a hustler and that he had felt it was time he had someone hustling for him. Looking back, that explanation reads as a confession of how badly he needed to believe in something. Klein wasn't there to save the Beatles. He was there to map their fault lines and then push. He understood Paul's need for absolute control, John's volatility, George's buried resentment, and Ringo's desperate hunger for peace, and every single one of those vulnerabilities became a tool. When Paul refused to sign Klein's management contract and brought in his own advisors instead, Klein positioned it to the others as an act of betrayal against them, and suddenly every meeting became a 3-against-1 confrontation with Klein providing the ammunition. The Beatles didn't collapse simply because 4 complicated men couldn't work together anymore. They collapsed because one calculating outsider transformed their private tensions into instruments and aimed them at each other with precision. And by 1970, the band was gone. By 1973, Klein had been removed and placed under legal investigation for the exact financial misconduct he had been trusted to prevent. And Ringo felt sick, not just with Klein but with himself for having believed someone so obviously dangerous. Years later, George Harrison told a confidant that the only way the Beatles could ever find their way back to each other was if Klein was completely out of the picture, that he was ready to try, and that Ringo was ready too. But the damage was already permanent. The window had closed for good. And for Ringo Starr, that was the wound that never softened across all the decades that followed, not because Klein had insulted him or underestimated him or taken his seat for an afternoon, but because Klein had taken the one thing that could never be rebuilt or replaced. He had taken the family. The one place Ringo Starr, the sick child from the dingle, the boy who fell behind while the world moved forward, the drummer nobody was entirely sure belonged there, had finally and completely and genuinely belonged.